They were born in 1898 and were last seen unchanged in 1934. 36 years had passed for everyone else in Ashford Falls, but for the Miller twins, time seemed to have stopped the moment they entered the world. This is the story of Anna and Elspeth Miller, two sisters who came into the world without a cry, whose names vanished from official records, and whose faces haunted a quiet Oregon town for decades. Over the years they were seen in fields, on the riverbank, even in the middle of town, always in the same white dresses, always untouched by age. The explanations ranged from medical rarity to superstition, but there was one thing that no one dared say aloud. Those who looked too closely into their story often didn't remain in Ashford Falls for long. What you're about to hear has been pieced together from what little survived: faded property disputes, missing census entries, and the hushed accounts of those who claim to have seen the girls themselves. Each account is incomplete, like fragments of a shattered mirror, but together they form a picture that cannot be explained away. And if you think you can guess where it leads, you might want to listen until the very end, because one of the last people to see the twins alive did so not in 1934, but more than 20 years later. Ashford Falls in 1898 was a small and self-contained place, hemmed in by pine forest and the slow curve of the Ashford River. John Miller was a man of the soil, quiet and broad-shouldered, while his wife Clara was known for her soft voice and for looking often toward the horizon, as though expecting someone. On a humid August night, Clara gave birth to twin girls in the front bedroom of their farmhouse. The midwife, Ruth Ansell, delivered them without trouble, but later told her sister something she never put in writing. The twins did not cry. They simply stared, their eyes pale to the point of colorlessness, and their faces calm in a way Ruth had never seen in a newborn. Their birth was recorded in the county ledger in neat, dark ink. 5 years later, that page was gone, torn cleanly from the book as though it had never been written. And that same summer, at the 4th of July picnic, the girls reappeared. They wore the same white dresses from their christening, and they looked exactly as they had on the night they were born. The 4th of July picnic in 1903 should have been an ordinary affair. A scatter of checkered blankets across the church green, the air warm with the smell of pies and roasted corn, children darting between tables while their parents lingered in the shade. Yet it was here, in the easy rhythm of the day, that the unease began to take root. People saw them first at a distance, two small figures standing apart from the bustle, their hands folded in front of them, their dresses white and unwrinkled despite the dust of the road. It was only when someone recognized their faces that the talking began to slow. Those who had known the Miller twins as infants in 1898 found themselves struck by the same thought. Nothing about them had changed. Their hair, pale as straw, was the same length it had been in the baptism photograph still kept by the church. Their faces were as smooth as porcelain, untouched by the marks of growing years. They were, in every visible way, exactly as they had been on the day of their birth. It was said later that Clara stood nearby, speaking quietly to no one in particular, her eyes fixed on the children rather than on the friends and neighbors she had not seen in months. John, for his part, kept close to the pie table, his posture guarded, offering short nods to anyone who approached. A few well-meaning souls tried to greet the girls, but received no more than a silent, polite gaze in return. It was not shyness nor rudeness. It was something colder. The sensation, as one woman put it, of being regarded as though from a great distance. The matter might have been dismissed as gossip were it not for the fact that the county ledger no longer contained their birth record. The page had been there once. Anyone who'd had business at the courthouse in the years after 1898 could recall seeing it. But now it was gone, removed so cleanly that even the clerk's replacement could not say when it had disappeared. He offered the same explanation to everyone who asked. Misplaced, most likely. We lose pages sometimes. But in a town where every birth, death, and marriage was accounted for, misplaced was a word that felt too easy. The Millers did not volunteer an explanation, and no one pressed them openly. Still, in kitchens and on porches, the same question was repeated. How could 5 years pass for the rest of Ashford Falls and not touch Anna and Elspeth Miller at all? 8 years after that strange picnic, the Millers were rarely seen in the centre of town. John came in alone for supplies, his shoulders more stooped than before, his eyes darting to the windows as though measuring the distance back to the road. Clara appeared even less, and when she did, she never lingered. The twins were almost never spotted until the summer of 1911, when a county fair brought a rare moment of commotion to Ashford Falls. The fair was small by city standards, but for the PT. Opal here it was a break from routine, livestock judging, homemade preserves, a worn carousel borrowed from a nearby town. Among the attractions was a travelling photographer offering portraits for a few cents. His backdrop was simple, his camera slow and cumbersome, but he promised to capture the essence of the day. Groups of children queued for their turn, and at some point, Anna and Elspeth Miller joined them. When the photographer developed the images a week later, one particular print caught his attention. A group of perhaps 8 children stood together, their faces serious in the fashion of the time. Some of the boys had grown lanky, their features sharpened by adolescence. The girls had the first traces of maturity in their eyes and expressions. And then there were the Miller twins, hair pale and neatly parted, white dresses immaculate, their faces identical not only to each other, but to the memory of those who had last seen them in 1898. The photographer mentioned his unease to a friend in town, who in turn shared it with others. Soon the photograph was being passed around behind counters and across kitchen tables. Some dismissed it, saying the stiffness of early photographs made everyone look unchanged. Others, however, felt something colder take hold, the certainty that they were looking at faces untouched by the 13 years since the twins' birth. If you've been listening closely, you'll understand why this photograph matters. It is not the only evidence we have, and it is far from the last. But it is the first physical proof that time may have passed for everyone else in Ashford Falls, and somehow skipped Anna and Elspeth Miller entirely. And if you think this picture is unsettling, stay with me until the end. Because the most disturbing account we have comes decades later, from someone who met the twins long after they should have been gone. The 1911 photograph was just the beginning. What came next would make it clear that the mystery of the Miller twins was not fading. It was growing darker. By 1915, the talk about the Miller twins had slipped beneath the surface of daily life in Ashford Falls. People still remembered, of course. They always remembered. But the subject was no longer raised in open conversation. It was as though the town had agreed, without saying so, to let the matter lie. But that unspoken truce cracked one autumn afternoon when a visiting physician was called to the Miller farm. His name was Dr. Samuel Aldridge, a man from Portland who had come to tend to a stubborn case of influenza spreading through the outlying farms. While in the area, he was asked to examine the twins. The reason for the visit has been lost to time. Perhaps a simple checkup, perhaps something more. But what the doctor observed was not written in any official record. The account we have comes from a fragment of a letter he sent to a colleague, a letter found decades later among unrelated papers. Aldridge wrote that the twins' physical development did not match their recorded ages. In his estimation, their height, bone density and teeth were consistent with children no older than 6. By the calendar, they should have been approaching their 17th year. More curious still, when he examined them separately, their heartbeats were not merely similar in rhythm, they were identical in pace and strength, as though one pulse echoed perfectly in the other's chest. He described it as 2 bodies tethered to a single metronome. The doctor made notes in his journal that night, intending to review them when he returned home, but those notes vanished before he left Ashford Falls. He later claimed to anyone who asked that he must have misplaced them. Within 2 months, Aldridge resigned his post in Portland and moved east, taking a position in Illinois. Whether that decision had anything to do with the Miller twins, no one could say. What can be said is that shortly after his visit, the twins were seen in the most unlikely of circumstances. A young man walking home from the mill late in the evening claimed he spotted them standing barefoot in fresh snow, their dresses bright against the dark woods. They stood without shivering, without speaking. When he glanced over his shoulder moments later, the place where they had stood was empty, and there were no footprints in the snow behind him. The story spread quietly through town, told in lowered voices. No one confronted the Millers directly, but something had shifted. It was no longer a question of whether Anna and Elspeth were different. It was a question of how. The year was 1921 when the next piece of the puzzle surfaced, not through rumor or a chance sighting, but in the cold formality of a courthouse document. It began as a simple matter, a property dispute between the Millers and a neighbouring farmer over a narrow strip of land along the Ashford River. The disagreement was minor, but the case required formal filings. Among them was a record naming the legal heirs to the Miller estate, Anna and Elspeth Miller. In itself, this was unremarkable, except for the detail that stopped the county clerk mid-sentence. The twins were listed as minors. By every measure of time known to Ashford Falls, the girls would have been 23 years old. Adults. Grown women by law and by any ordinary standard. And yet, here in black ink, in a legal document signed by John Miller himself, they were children still. The clerk mentioned it in passing to a visiting journalist from Salem, a man in town to cover the ongoing development of the logging industry. The journalist's curiosity was piqued, and what began as polite conversation soon turned into determined inquiry. He asked questions of townsfolk, traced back through census records, and pieced together the scattered accounts that most locals preferred not to dwell on. For 2 weeks he moved quietly through Ashford Falls, gathering dates, names, and testimonies. Several people told him of the girls' unchanged appearance over the years. One elderly woman recounted the 4th of July picnic in 1903. Another spoke of the photograph from the 1911 fair, still kept in a desk drawer. The journalist promised his readers in Salem a story most curious and difficult to dismiss. Then, one morning, he was gone. His room at the boarding house was left as if he had stepped out for a moment and never returned. The draft of his article was found in the desk, ending abruptly in the middle of a sentence. And so, the evidence, though fragmentary, suggests that time itself, nothing more. No follow-up was ever published under his name. The property dispute was settled quietly, the land in question reverting to the Millers. The courthouse record remains in the county archive to this day, the word minors still stark against the page. And for those who had long whispered about the twins, the document was not just a curiosity. It was proof. Proof that whatever was happening to Anna and Elspeth Miller, it was not confined to rumour, to chance photographs, or to fading memory. It had made its way into the official history of Ashford Falls. By the late autumn of 1924, Ashford Falls had a new schoolteacher, a young woman named Margaret Hale. Fresh from the city, she was unaccustomed to the slow, deliberate pace of rural life, but she took to her work with energy. Her duties included travelling to outlying farms to provide lessons for children who could not make the daily walk into town. It was during one of these rounds that she was directed to the Miller farmhouse. Margaret arrived on a grey afternoon, the kind where the air felt heavy and still. Clara Miller answered the door, her expression polite but unreadable, and led her to a small parlour. There, at a table by the window, sat Anna and Elspeth. They wore the same style of white dresses described by townsfolk for years, their pale hair neatly parted and smoothed. The lesson began without incident. Margaret found the girls attentive, but their manner unsettled her. They spoke in short, even tones, answering every question correctly and at the same time, not in turns, but as if their voices shared a single thought. When one reached for a pencil, the other's hand moved in perfect synchrony. It was not mimicry. It was something more deliberate, as though each action was part of an invisible pattern. As the hour passed, Margaret became aware of an odd detail she could not immediately place. It was only when she gathered her books to leave that she realized what it was. The light from the window cast the girls' shadows across the wall, But those shadows did not shift when the girls moved. She saw it clearly. Anna, leaning slightly forward, Elspeth turning her head, yet their dark outlines remained fixed, unchanging. Margaret said nothing then. She thanked Clara for her time and stepped out into the cool air, but she did not take the road straight back to town. Instead, she walked into the woods and sat for some time, trying to calm the unease that had taken hold of her. That evening, she told a fellow teacher she would not be returning to the Miller home. When asked why, she offered no explanation beyond that the place felt wrong. She did not share the truth until years later, long after she had left Ashford Falls. By then, the details of the twins' stillness, their synchronized voices, and their fixed shadows had become one more story folded into the larger, darker tapestry of the Miller twins, a tapestry that was growing more intricate with each passing year. The winter of 1934 was one of the harshest Ashford Falls had seen in decades. Heavy snow blanketed the fields and pressed against the doors of the houses, and when the thaw came in late January, the Ashford River swelled beyond its banks, pulling down fence lines and floats, oding low ground. It was in the days after the waters began to recede that two men from the western farms, out to check the damage, saw something they would never forget. They had reached a bend in the river where the snow lay untouched, except for the narrow strip of mud left by the retreating water. There, standing at the very edge, were two girls in white dresses. Their hair, pale as frost, hung loose down their backs. The men called out, but the girls did not turn. Instead, they stood side by side, hands at their sides, gazing into the slow, dark current, as though watching something beneath the surface. The men approached, their boots crunching in the snow, but before they could close the distance, the girls turned in unison and walked toward the tree line. Their movements were calm, unhurried. By the time the men reached the spot where they had stood, the girls had vanished into the woods, leaving no prints in the soft snow behind them. Later that day, the county coroner sent a sealed envelope to the sheriff's office. Inside was a single black-and-white photograph showing the twins exactly as the men had described them, standing at the river's edge in their white dresses, the snow around them unbroken. On the back, in neat handwriting, was a date: January 1934. Recovered. No one ever learned who had taken the photograph or under what circumstances it had been recovered. The sheriff ordered the envelope stored in the courthouse archives. A few years later, when a clerk was tasked with retrieving it for a visiting researcher, it was gone. The index showed no record of its removal, no request, no signature. When the sheriff was asked about it, he replied only that some things aren't meant to be found again. For the people of Ashford Falls, the riverbank sighting was the last time anyone in town admitted to seeing Anna and Elspeth Miller. But in the quiet retellings, behind closed doors, there was always the same unease. The sense that the girls had not left the riverbank at all, only stepped out of sight, waiting for the right moment to be seen again. After the riverbank sighting in 1934, a strange quiet settled over Ashford Falls. It wasn't that people forgot the Miller twins, no one truly could, but that their names were no longer spoken aloud. The incident by the river, the sealed photograph, the missing file, these things were not denied, only left to fade into the corners of private memory. Conversations that once carried a hint of curiosity now ended abruptly when the subject arose. It was as though the entire town had reached an unspoken agreement. To acknowledge the twins was to invite them back. Whether this belief came from superstition, fear, or some other unarticulated instinct, it took hold quickly. The younger residents, who had never seen the girls themselves, grew up hearing only fragments, overheard remarks from grandparents, a hushed correction when a question was asked. In time, even those fragments thinned. Yet the silence was not complete. There were always a few who refused to let the matter rest, Some were drawn by the peculiar gaps in the town's history, missing ledger pages, altered Bible entries, contradictory census reports. Others were simply unsettled by the way certain events lined up too neatly with the twins' rare appearances, sudden floods, unseasonal frost, inexplicable disappearances. These few spoke in whispers, passing their suspicions like contraband between trusted ears. One of them, an aging clerk who had worked at the courthouse for decades, claimed that the missing 1934 photograph had not been stolen or lost. It had been removed deliberately, he said, by someone with the authority to make it vanish from the record. He would not give a name, but his tone suggested that the choice had not been made lightly. Some things, he told a listener in confidence, aren't just missing, they're kept missing. But for most, the matter was simpler. The fewer words given to the twins, the better. A farmer who had lived along the river for 50 years summed it up to a neighbour over a fence post. They come when they're talked about, so I don't talk. Whether this was an old belief or something learned from experience, no one challenged it. The silence became part of the fabric of Ashford Falls. And while it may have kept the twins from returning, or perhaps only seemed to, it also ensured that, in time, the details of who they were and what had been seen would blur, becoming a ghost story that belonged more to the shadows than to the daylight. Even with the town's silence, stories still found their way through. They came not from the centre of Ashford Falls, but from its edges, the stretches of forest, the hunting trails, the lonely bends of the river where few people passed. Hunters spoke of voices they heard when the wind fell still, two girls speaking in low tones just out of sight. The words, they claimed, were never quite clear, but the voices were identical, as if one were an echo of the other. A trapper passing through in the winter of 1938 told the sheriff he had seen two figures ahead of him on a narrow trail. They were small, wearing pale clothing that stood out against the dark pines. He called out a greeting, but neither turned. When he quickened his pace, the figures kept their distance, always just far enough ahead that he could never close the gap. After several minutes, they stepped into a stand of fir trees, and when he followed, the space was empty, the snow undisturbed. The trapper, a man with no ties to Ashford Falls, left town the next day and never returned. Farmers along the Western Road sometimes mentioned finding their gates open in the morning, though they swore they had latched them the night before. A few spoke in careful tones of seeing two girls at the far edge of their fields near dusk. The figures never came closer, never moved toward the houses. They simply stood, hands at their sides, and then were gone. These sightings were never entered into any official record. No one wanted to be the person who tried to convince the sheriff of something the whole town had decided not to talk about. But in the privacy of kitchens and barns, the tales grew. One man insisted he had heard singing in the forest, faint and high, the words carried away by the wind. Another claimed he had seen the twins wading in the shallows of the river in the middle of January, the water black with ice, yet the girls standing as if it were summer. And always the description was the same. White dresses, pale hair, faces untouched by time. The years passed, but the girls, if they were the same ones born in 1898, did not change. In the rare moments when someone tried to dismiss these stories as mistaken identity, there was never an answer for the question that followed. If they weren't the Miller twins, then who were they? The first of the old records came to light by accident. In the early 1940s, the county clerk's office began a routine effort to repair and rebind some of its older ledgers. Among the volumes brought out from storage was the birth register for the year 1898. Its cover was worn, its pages yellowed with age, but the binding was intact, except for one section near the middle. Here, a single page was missing, torn clean from its stitching. The tear was so precise it seemed deliberate, not the fray of time or careless handling. The clerk, a young man new to the job, asked the older staff what had been on the missing page. Most shrugged, but one woman who had worked in the office for decades hesitated before answering. "The Miller twins,"
she said quietly, as though the name itself carried weight. When pressed for more, she simply shook her head.
A few months later, a different discovery was made in the attic of the Miller farmhouse after it passed into the hands of distant relatives. Among the dusty boxes and stacks of old newspapers was a heavy family Bible. Its leather cover was cracked, its pages brittle. Most of it was unremarkable. Lists of births, marriages, and deaths in the neat hand of successive generations. But in the section for births, 2 entries had been glued shut with a thin, even layer of adhesive, so precise it was clear someone had taken great care to seal them. The new owners, curious, worked at the edges until the pages came apart. The first entry was as expected: John Miller, born 1868. The second, however, did not match the family's known history. It listed Anna and Elspeth Miller, but the year was 1872, more than 2 decades before their supposed birth in 1898. No explanation accompanied the entry, and no other record in the Bible mentioned them again. Word of the find reached a few in town, though most dismissed it as a clerical quirk or a relative with a poor memory for dates. But for those who had kept track of the twins' strange appearances, the 1872 date was not just an error. It was another crack in the story they had been told. If the girls had existed before, then the mystery was deeper than anyone had guessed. The Bible was kept by the relatives for some years before disappearing from sight. Whether it was lost, destroyed, or locked away is unknown. But the memory of those 2 glued pages remained, a silent testament to the fact that the story of the Miller twins might have begun long before Ashford Falls ever knew their names. The census records of Ashford Falls were as straightforward as any in a small rural town. Columns of names, ages, occupations, each household neatly accounted for every 10 years. But when a regional historian reviewed the town's records while compiling a local archive, he noticed something that made him stop. In 1900, the Miller twins were listed by name, infants in the household of John and Clara Miller. In 1910, their names appeared again, though their recorded ages were strangely low, just 6 years old, when by any normal count they should have been 12. In 1920, the twins were absent entirely, as if they had never existed. John and Clara were listed, their ages correct, their occupations unchanged, but no children were recorded in the household. Then in 1930, there they were again, Anna and Elspeth Miller, both marked as age 6. The handwriting was neat, the ink fresh, and the entries matched the rest of the census as if nothing were out of place. The historian checked for possible transcription errors, but the original forms told the same story. The ages were wrong in a way that could not be explained by oversight. More than that, the entries seemed to follow no natural progression. The girls appeared, disappeared, and then reappeared with their ages unchanged, as though time moved for everyone else and simply circled back for them. When he asked the county office about it, the staff offered polite but brief answers. Clerical mistakes were common in rural census work, they said, but when he pressed for supporting records, school rosters, church registers, anything that might confirm the twins' whereabouts in the missing years, the trail went cold. Some documents had been lost in fires, others misplaced, still others missing entirely without explanation. One former census enumerator, approached in his old age, admitted quietly that he had been instructed to leave certain names off his 1920 list. He would not say who had given the order or why, only that it was easier for everyone that way. When asked what became of the girls, he gave a small shake of his head and muttered, "Some things don't belong in the count." The pattern was clear. Anna and Elspeth existed when the record said they did, and they vanished when it said they didn't. And the fact that the official history of Ashford Falls could be rewritten so easily raised a darker question. Who was doing the rewriting, and for whose benefit? If there was one constant in the scattered sightings and half-remembered accounts of the Miller twins, it was water, and more specifically, the Ashford River. From their earliest appearances to their last confirmed sighting in 1934, The river seemed to draw them as surely as it drew the winter ice and the spring floods. Even in the quiet years, when no one admitted to seeing the twins in town or on the roads, someone could always be found who had spotted two pale figures along the banks. The Ashford River was not wide, but it was deep in places, its currents strong and unpredictable. Old-timers claimed it was a hungry river, taking more than its share of livestock, wagons, and on rare occasions people. Local superstition held that the river remembered the dead, carrying their presence along its bends and shallows. Whether the twins were part of that belief or the cause of it, no one could say for certain. One farmer swore he had seen them standing knee-deep in the water one February morning, the frost still clinging to the reeds. They were barefoot, their white dresses moving in the slow current. When he called to them, they turned their heads in unison, but did not speak. He looked away only long enough to steady his footing on the icy bank, and when he looked back, the water where they had stood was empty. Fishermen told similar stories. Hooks snagged on nothing, lines pulled taut in the shallows without a fish in sight, followed by the sudden, silent appearance of the two girls on the far bank. In every account, they were dry, their hair and dresses untouched by the dampness that clung to everyone else who came near the river. Some believed the water was the key to their strange condition, that it was the river and not the twins themselves that defied the passage of time. Others thought the opposite, that the girls were bound to it somehow, unable to stray too far without being drawn back. A few whispered that the Miller farm had been built too close to its banks, and that whatever the land had once belonged to had never truly let it go. By the mid-20th century, the river and the twins had become inseparable in local memory. Ask about one, and the other would surface in the telling, and though no one could explain why the water seemed to hold them, there was an unspoken understanding. If you were alone near the Ashford River and saw two figures standing still in the current, it was best to turn away and keep walking. Few in Ashford Falls had reason to step inside the Miller farmhouse, and fewer still could say they had been invited. Those who did recalled an atmosphere unlike any other home in the county. Not hostile exactly, but still as though the air carried a weight. One such visitor was Helen Price, a neighbour who had known Clara Miller since before the twins were born. In the winter of 1927, after John Miller injured his hand in a farming accident, Helen came by to deliver bread and check on the family. She remembered being greeted at the door by Clara, who spoke politely but without warmth, as if each word was chosen and measured. Inside, the house was orderly, cleaner than most, but strangely devoid of the small signs of daily life. No boots drying by the hearth, no coats hung near the door, no toys or books out of place. The parlour was neat to the point of sterility, chairs aligned perfectly, a tablecloth without a wrinkle. The twins were seated together in the far corner, hands folded in their laps. They did not speak when Helen entered, nor did they rise, only watched her with those pale, steady eyes. Helen tried a gentle question about their schooling, but the only response was a brief glance exchanged between them, as if deciding whether to answer, followed by silence. As Clara poured tea, Helen noticed something else, a faint, steady sound beneath the hush of the room. At first she thought it was the wind in the chimney, but it was too regular, too deliberate. It was a sound like breathing, slow and deep, but coming from somewhere within the walls. She glanced toward it more than once, but could see nothing to explain it. She did not mention it to Clara, nor did she stay long. On her way home, she told herself it must have been the settling of the house in the cold, or the groan of old timbers. Still, the sound lingered in her mind, as did the image of the twins' unblinking faces in the dim light of the parlour. Helen never went back inside the Miller home. In later years, when she did speak of that afternoon, she always ended her recollection with the same words. It wasn't the way they looked at me that I remember most. It was knowing somehow that whatever was in that house, it wasn't just the four of them. The small cemetery on the hill above Ashford Falls was older than the town itself. its earliest stones weathered smooth by rain and wind. Most of the graves belonged to the first families who had settled the valley, their names still known to a few of the older residents. In the late 1940s, during a routine clearing of overgrown brush, a pair of headstones were uncovered near the far edge, half buried under decades of moss and soil. The stones were simple, carved in a hand that suggested a local mason. Both were marked with the same date of death, August 14, 1872, and both bore the same names, Anna Miller and Elspeth Miller. The lettering was still legible, though softened by time. There were no ages given, only the names and the date. The discovery caused a brief stir among the volunteers working that day. A few recognized the names, and for a moment the old stories came back to the surface. How could the twins, supposedly born in 1898, be buried here more than 25 years earlier? Some speculated that they must have been relatives, perhaps cousins, or a previous set of twins from an earlier generation. But when the town's records were checked, there was no birth, death, or marriage entry for any Anna or Elspeth Miller in 1872. The location of the graves was odd as well. They were set apart from the main rows, near the stone wall that marked the boundary of the cemetery. The ground there was uneven, as if it had shifted over the years, and the soil around the markers was darker than the rest, suggesting it had been disturbed long after the original burial. An older resident, when told of the find, claimed he had heard of these stones before. His grandfather had once pointed toward that part of the cemetery and said it was best to leave it alone. "Not everything in the ground wants to stay there," the old man had warned. The headstones were cleaned, the moss removed, and they were left standing where they had been found. But in the months that followed, some swore the names on them would fade and reappear, as if the stone itself resisted being read. Others noticed that the flowers and grass near the graves never seemed to last, wilting within days, no matter the season. Whether these graves marked an earlier chapter in the story of the Miller twins, or belonged to someone else entirely, no one could say. But for those who had long suspected that the twins' history reached further back than 1898, the stones on the hill felt less like coincidence and more like confirmation. By the time the 1950s arrived, the older generation of Ashford Falls carried the memory of the Miller twins like a splinter, buried deep, seldom mentioned, but never entirely gone. For those who still whispered about them, one unsettling pattern had begun to take shape: disappearances in the county that seemed to align, in time if not always in place, with the rare accounts of the twins being seen. The earliest case tied to this pattern was from 1907, when a farmhand named Thomas Reeve vanished while walking home from the mill after dark. His hat was found on the road the next morning, dusted with frost despite a warm night. In 1919, a boy of 11 disappeared while fishing along the Ashford River. His rod and creel were recovered from the bank, but no footprints led away from the spot. In both instances, a handful of people quietly noted that the twins had been seen in the vicinity within days of the event. There were other stories, just as vague but no less troubling. A traveling salesman in 1926 who failed to arrive at his next stop. The sheriff later admitted, off record, that 2 young girls in white dresses had been reported walking along the road that same week. In 1932, a widowed woman living on the outskirts of town vanished from her home, leaving behind a half-prepared meal and an open back door. A neighbor claimed to have seen 2 small figures moving along the tree line behind the house, but when pressed, she retracted the statement, saying she must have been mistaken. The most haunting link came in 1934, the year of the riverbank sighting. Just days after the 2 men saw the twins at the water's edge, a young man from the Western Farms disappeared during the flood cleanup. His tools were found neatly stacked beside a fence, as if he had stepped away for only a moment. To be clear, none of these cases were ever solved, and not all were widely known beyond those directly involved. But for the few who kept track of such things, the coincidence was too sharp to ignore. Each disappearance left behind no clear trail, no sign of struggle, only a date and a place that, more often than not, brushed up against the strange and intermittent presence of Anna and Elspeth Miller. Whether the twins were witnesses, omens, or something far more entwined with the vanishings, the truth remained out of reach. But the pattern was there, like a thread woven through the county's quiet tragedies, always leading back to the same pale figures in white. The courthouse in Ashford Falls was not large, but its archives went back further than anyone alive could remember. Most of what it stored was ordinary: deeds, marriage licenses, tax records, the paper backbone of a quiet rural town. But among those who worked there was a persistent rumor about a particular box kept in the locked storage room in the basement. The box was said to be wooden, dark with age, its lid fitted with a simple brass clasp. It bore no label, only a small tag with a number written in fading ink. No one seemed to know who had first placed it there, though the prevailing claim was that it had arrived sometime in the mid-1930s. Its contents were known only by hearsay, but the stories were consistent enough to suggest there was truth in them: the sealed photograph from the 1934 riverbank sighting, the torn page from the 1898 birth ledger, perhaps even the glued Bible pages that had succeeded, effaced briefly before disappearing again. A former clerk, speaking years after his retirement, swore that he had once seen the box opened. Inside, he said, were not just documents, but a small envelope containing 2 strands of hair, pale as ash, tied together with white thread. There was also a child's shoe, no larger than the palm of a hand, stained dark along the sole, as if it had been pressed into wet earth. If the clerk's story was true, he did not say why these items were kept, or by whose order. But he claimed that after that day, he never spoke of the twins again, not because he forgot, but because, as he put it, the less I said, the less I dreamed about them. Over the years, requests to examine the box were met with polite refusals or claims that no such thing existed. The official line was that the archives contained nothing unusual, and that any missing or damaged records were the result of time and mishandling. Yet the rumor of the box persisted, passed quietly between staff, each adding their own small detail to the legend. Some believed it was a deliberate safeguard, that the town, or someone within it, had gathered everything about the Miller twins into one place to keep it from scattering again. Others thought it was more than that the box was not merely for storage but for containment, as if whatever was inside had to be kept together and kept closed. By the early 1970s, nearly everyone who had known the Miller twins firsthand was gone. Only one person remained who claimed to have seen them with their own eyes, a woman named Louise Harper, then in her 90s and living in a care home 2 towns over. Her memory was sharp in some places and hazy in others, but when she spoke of the day she encountered Anna and Elspeth, her voice took on a clarity that seemed to strip away the years. She had been 8 years old in the spring of 1910, walking home from school along a path that cut through a grove of young maples. The air was cool, the buds just starting to open, and she could hear the Ashford River in the distance. As she rounded a bend, she saw 2 girls standing ahead of her, their dresses white and perfectly clean despite the damp ground. They were holding hands, their heads tilted slightly toward each other, as if listening to something Louise could not hear. At first she thought they might be new children in town, though she found it strange she hadn't seen them in school. She called out a greeting, but they did not answer. Instead, they turned toward her in unison, and Louise saw their faces clearly, identical, pale-skinned, their eyes an almost colourless grey. "They looked at me," she said, "as if they were deciding whether I should be there." The moment stretched, silent except for the wind moving through the trees. Then, without a word, the girls stepped backward, still holding hands, until the shadows of the trees seemed to fold around them. When Louise reached the spot where they had stood, the path ahead was empty. There were no footprints, not even in the soft mud left by the previous night's rain. Louise told her parents what she had seen, but they dismissed it as a dream or a trick of the light. Years later, When she saw the 1911 County Fair photograph, she recognized the faces instantly. "They hadn't changed," she said. "Not in the slightest. And I knew then that they never would." She could not say what the twins were, nor what they wanted, but she was certain of one thing. They had seen her just as clearly as she had seen them. And whatever decision they had made that day, to let her pass unharmed, to let her forget, had followed her for the rest of her life. In the years that followed Louise Harper's testimony, a handful of researchers and amateur historians tried to make sense of the Miller twins without resorting to superstition. Their reasoning was simple. If something existed in the world, it had to obey the rules of the world. And so they began with the most obvious question. How could two girls appear not to age over the course of decades? The first theories leaned toward medical explanations. Some suggested the twins might have suffered from a rare growth disorder, the kind that slowed physical development dramatically. Others proposed hormonal imbalances, malnutrition, or environmental factors specific to rural Oregon at the turn of the century. But each idea stumbled over the same problem. The photographic and eyewitness accounts didn't just show slowed growth, they showed no change at all. Skin, hair, posture, even the smallest features of the face remained fixed across decades, immune to the subtle erosion that time brought to everyone else. Next came the substitution theory, the claim that Anna and Elspeth had died young and been replaced by other children who looked like them. The trouble was that no records of additional children existed, no births or adoptions, no signs of other Millers fitting their description, and those who had seen the twins up close insisted they were the same individuals, not merely similar. Their mannerisms, the way they moved in perfect synchronization, the strange stillness in their gaze, these were not traits that could be imitated easily, let alone duplicated. A more elaborate idea came from a geneticist in the 1960s, who speculated that the twins might have been identical not just in appearance, but in some deeper biological sense, a perfect replication at the cellular level, resistant to aging. But when pressed for evidence, he admitted he had none. Without tissue samples or direct examination, it was just an exercise in possibility. In the end, every scientific attempt collapsed under the same weight, the timeline. Even the most generous explanations could not reconcile the unchanged photograph from 1898 with the identical photograph from 1934, nor with the claimed sighting in the 1950s. One historian summed it up bluntly in his notes. To explain the Miller TWTs, "Inns, you must either accept a supernatural cause or accept that they do not exist at all." But the latter was hard to argue when the accounts came from dozens of unrelated sources over more than half a century. Theories could be written and dismissed, but the facts, such as they were, remained. And the facts, as far as anyone could tell, refused to fit inside the limits of reason. Among the quieter threads in the story of Anna and Elspeth Miller was a pattern that took years to notice. It wasn't in the records of births or property disputes, nor in the scattered eyewitness accounts. It was in the weather. Farmers in Ashford Falls had long kept their own logs of rainfall, frost, and harvest yields. These journals, passed down from one generation to the next, were as precise as any official record, and in the margins of more than a few, curious notes appeared. Besides certain dates that lined up with known or suspected sightings of the twins, there were brief remarks: river high despite no rain, heavy frost in July, hail without storm clouds. The earliest example came from 1903, the summer of the 4th of July picnic, when the twins were first seen again after their birth. A farmer wrote of a sudden chill settling over the green in the middle of the day, enough to make children shiver in their light clothes. In 1911, the week of the county fair photograph, multiple accounts noted a dense morning fog that lingered until nearly noon, even as the sun burned hot above it. In 1926, when a travelling salesman disappeared after being last seen on the road outside town, the weather log for that week recorded ice along the riverbank. Unseasonable. And in 1934, the year of the riverbank sighting, the thaw came early, bringing the flood that swelled the Ashford River past its banks. Some swore the snow had melted faster near the Miller farm than anywhere else. Later sightings carried similar oddities. A man fishing in 1947 claimed the air around him grew still and cold, moments before he noticed two figures standing on the opposite bank. In the 1950s, during what may have been the last reported encounter, a sudden wind tore through the clearing, scattering leaves in a spiral around the twins, but leaving the rest of the woods untouched. Skeptics pointed out that weather was fickle in the valley and that coincidence could explain the overlap. But those who believed saw it differently. The changes were not just coincidences, but signs. The twins didn't simply exist in Ashford Falls. They carried something with them, something that bent the air, the water, even the seasons in their wake. And if that was true, then perhaps it was not the people of Ashford Falls who noticed the twins first, but the land itself. By the late 1950s, the Millers themselves had long vanished from public life, but their names still appeared in certain county records, not in the usual places, but in the fine print of wills, deeds, and probate filings. Those who knew where to look began to notice something odd. John and Clara Miller had lived longer than almost anyone expected. John's death was recorded in 1949 at the age of 81, and Clara's not until 1954 at 84. In a time and place where the average life expectancy fell far short of that, their longevity stood out. This in itself might have been dismissed as good fortune or sturdy constitution, if not fools, but the whispers that followed. Several locals claimed that in the years before their deaths, the twins were still seen at the Miller farmhouse, unchanged, as they had always been. If true, this would mean Anna and Elspeth had lived with their parents for more than half a century without aging a day. Rumours took on a darker shape when it was noted that the property transfers after John and Clara's deaths listed the heirs simply as Anna Miller and Elspeth Miller, without any indication of their age. There were no marriage records, no death certificates, and no indication the land had ever left the family's control. In the telling, these facts twisted into a theory that the twins had somehow been the reason their parents lived so long. Some spoke of them as caretakers, others as something closer to guardians, not out of affection, but out of necessity. The notion went further in certain circles, suggesting that the Millers' unusual longevity was a side effect of simply being near the twins for so many years. One old farmhand who had worked their land briefly in the 1940s claimed John Miller told him, "You stay close enough, you last longer. You drift too far, you don't." When asked what he meant, John supposedly changed the subject and never returned to it. Whether the inheritance was a matter of legal continuity or something less ordinary, no one outside the county office ever saw the original paperwork. Those who tried were told the documents were archived elsewhere, and so the story of the Miller twins and the family land became just another layer of the larger mystery, a piece of property that seemed to resist leaving their hands, much like the years seemed to resist leaving their faces. The last official trace of Anna and Elspeth Miller appeared in the 1960 federal census, and even then it was easy to miss. By that time, the Miller farmhouse was listed as a household of 2 residents, both recorded simply as female, unmarried, with the ages marked as 6. The handwriting was steady, the ink consistent with the rest of the page, as if the enumerator had written it without hesitation. For most of the country, a census entry was a formality, a line in a ledger, a government record soon forgotten. But for those in Ashford Falls who knew the history, the sight of those numbers was like seeing an old ghost step briefly into the light. It had been more than 60 years since the twins' birth in 1898, and yet here they were again, unchanged, their existence reaffirmed in the most official way possible. When the census sheets were made public years later, a few curious researchers tried to track down the enumerator responsible for that district. They found he had died in the early 1970s, leaving behind no notes or statements about his work in Ashford Falls. One former neighbour claimed the man had mentioned the census only once. saying there were things you write down because they're there, and things you write down because you're told to. After 1960, the twins' names never appeared in another census. By 1970, the farmhouse was listed as vacant, and in 1980, the property was marked as abandoned entirely. There were no forwarding addresses, no legal transfers of ownership beyond the vague note that the land was under review. The Miller name vanished from the county rolls without ceremony, leaving only the decades of speculation behind it. Some believed the 1960 entry was a clerical error, a misplaced set of numbers meant for another household. But for those who had kept watch over the years, it was a confirmation, a final, undeniable proof that Anna and Elspeth had been here long after they should have been gone. And if they had still been in Ashford Falls in 1960, the next question was inescapable. Where had they gone in the years that followed? There were no records of their deaths, no burials, no obituaries, just a sudden clean break in the paper trail, as if the twins had stepped out of the frame and taken the last of their history with them. By the time the Miller farmhouse was officially listed as abandoned in the early 1980s, it had already been standing empty for years. The paint on its clapboard siding had long since peeled away, exposing the grey wood beneath. The shutters hung crooked, some swaying loosely when the wind came down from the hills. From the road, it looked like any other neglected property left behind when a family moved on, but in Ashford Falls, people knew better than to call it empty. Those who lived nearby claimed the curtains in the upstairs windows were sometimes drawn back, though no one had been seen entering or leaving in decades. A mail carrier once swore he heard voices inside while delivering a notice to the front door. Soft, even, and speaking in a rhythm that reminded him of children reciting a lesson. When he stepped back to listen more closely, the sound stopped, replaced by a silence that felt deliberate. A group of teenagers, emboldened by local rumors, tried to explore the house one summer night. They found the front door locked, but managed to pry open a side window. Inside, the air was stale and cold, carrying the faint scent of something like damp linen. The furniture was in place, covered in a thin layer of dust. Yet the dust was disturbed in narrow parallel lines across the floor, as if two people had walked side by side through the same paths over and over. One of the boys opened a drawer in the parlor cabinet and found a stack of neatly folded white dresses, each identical, each the size for a small child. The fabric was clean, too clean for garments left in an abandoned house for years. Another swore he heard faint footsteps upstairs, though when they went to look, the rooms were empty and the floors unmarked. They left in a hurry, taking nothing with them. Later, when asked why they hadn't stayed longer, one replied, "It felt like we weren't alone, and whoever else was there already knew us." Over time, the house fell further into disrepair. Vines crawled up the porch and the roof began to sag, but no one in town spoke seriously of tearing it down. Perhaps it was superstition, or perhaps it was the quiet knowledge that whatever had once lived there, and whatever might still linger, was best left undisturbed. The strangest twist in the story of the Miller twins came not from the people of Ashford Falls, but from someone's, he who had never heard their names before. In the summer of 1956, long after most locals believed the twins had vanished from public view, a travelling surveyor named Harold Denton was hired to map property boundaries along the Ashford River. He was from out of state, with no connection to the town and no knowledge of its old stories. On his second day, while measuring a section of overgrown land near the old Miller property, Denton noticed two girls standing at the edge of the tree line. They were dressed in white, their hair pale and straight, falling to their shoulders. From their size, he guessed them to be no older than 7 or 8. He raised a hand in greeting, but they didn't respond, only turned their heads toward him in perfect unison. He recalled later that the moment was oddly still, as if the air itself had paused. Then the girls stepped backward into the shadows of the trees and were gone. Thinking they belonged to a nearby family, Denton mentioned the encounter at the diner that evening, asking who in town had young twins. The diner went quiet, A few patrons exchanged looks, and one older man asked Denton to describe the girls again. When he did, the man told him plainly, "Those aren't anyone's children." Another added, "Best you don't go looking for them." Confused, Denton pressed for details, but the conversation ended there. Later, one of the waitresses quietly told him he might have seen the Miller girls, and that if he had, he should count himself lucky nothing more had happened. She wouldn't say what that meant. Years afterward, when Denton learned about the legends surrounding Anna and Elspeth, the memory of that day returned to him in sharp detail. The dresses, the hair, the way they moved, all matched the descriptions given by people who had seen the twins decades earlier. He realized with a kind of uneasy certainty that whatever he had seen in 1956 could not have been ordinary children. For the townspeople, his story was both a surprise and a confirmation. It meant the twins had still been there, quietly watching, long after their names had vanished from official records. And it raised a darker question. If they could appear to an outsider with no knowledge of them, how many others might have seen the Miller twins and never understood what they were looking at? By the 1990s, the Miller twins had become more rumor than history, their stories scattered across fading documents, conflicting recollections, and the occasional half-whispered warning from the oldest residents of Ashford Falls. It was around this time that a small group of local historians and genealogists decided to try something no one had attempted before: to gather every scrap of information about Anna and Elspeth Miller into a single, comprehensive record. They began with what was accessible: birth and death ledgers, property deeds, school registers, and census data. The gaps appeared immediately. There were years where the twins' names should have been present but weren't, legal disputes where they were listed as minors decades past childhood, and family records that contradicted one another. The 1898 birth entry was, of course, missing, just as it had been for decades. But one researcher managed to find a copy of the town's church baptism register for that year. The page was intact, yet in the space where the twins' names should have been, the ink had bled into a dark, featureless blot. Interviews with surviving townspeople proved just as uneven. Some swore they had never seen the girls, had never even heard the name Miller, except in the context of old land parcels. Others, often unprompted, would offer exact descriptions: white dresses, pale hair, identical expressions, as if the memory had been waiting just beneath the surface to be spoken aloud. The group also collected stories from outside Ashford Falls, reaching back to accounts like Harold Denton's 1956 sighting. A few were easy to dismiss, the kind of campfire tales that grow with the telling, but others carried a consistency of detail too precise to ignore. One of the most intriguing finds was a set of letters written by a visiting academic in 1935 who had come to study rural communities in the Pacific Northwest. In one letter to his wife, he described 2 children by the riverbank, standing as still as trees. He noted their appearance without comment, as if he considered it unremarkable, until the next letter, written 2 days later, in which he mentioned having seen them again in the same place, wearing the same clothes. Despite their efforts, the researchers found no conclusive answer, but their work did something else. It pulled the Miller twins back into the public mind. And as the past showed, whenever the twins were spoken of too often, their story had a way of stepping out of history and back into the present. For most of his career, Daniel Keene prided himself on dismantling local legends. A writer for a regional history magazine, he specialized in taking apart ghost stories and small-town myths, tracing them back to their roots in misremembered events or deliberate invention. When he first heard about the Miller twins from a colleague, he treated it the same way he always did, as a curiosity to be explained, nothing more. Keene arrived in Ashford Falls in the spring of 2001, armed with copies of census sheets, property maps, and a folder of old photographs. His goal was simple: prove that Anna and Elspeth Miller were either the product of mistaken identity or a long-running family tale that had taken on a life of its own. He interviewed townspeople, visited the cemetery, and combed through what remained of the county archives. By the second week, he was confident he had his conclusion. The missing ledger pages, the contradictory ages in the census, all could be chalked up to clerical sloppiness and the way stories grow in the telling. Then, on his last evening in town, he took a walk along the Ashford River. The sun had dipped low, and the water carried the gold and red of the sky. Ahead on the far bank, two figures stood. They were small, dressed in white, their hair pale against the gathering dark. At first he thought they were children from one of the nearby farms. He raised a hand to wave. Both girls turned toward him at exactly the same moment. The distance was enough that he could not make out their eyes, but he felt with sudden and unshakable certainty that they were looking directly at him, not just in his direction, but at him, as if they had known all along where he would be and when. Neither moved. The river between them was silent, reflecting the stillness of the scene. Then, without a word, they stepped backward into the shadow of the trees and were gone. Keane left Ashford Falls the next morning without finishing his article. When pressed about it later, he would only say that some stories do not need to be explained. Privately, he admitted to a friend that for the first time in his life, he had no interest in finding the real explanation. Whatever he had seen on that riverbank, he believed it was exactly what the town had been whispering about for more than a century. The last known sighting of the Miller twins came in the autumn of 1974, though it would not be spoken of publicly for nearly 20 years. The witness was a man named Paul Hensley, a retired railroad worker who had moved to Ashford Falls late in life. He kept mostly to himself, living in a small cabin near the old logging road west of town. On an October afternoon, while cutting across a stretch of overgrown meadow to check his fence line, Hensley noticed two figures standing at the far end of the field. They were side by side, both wearing white dresses, their pale hair loose around their shoulders. From the distance, they appeared to be children, but something in their posture gave him pause. They were perfectly still, their hands resting at their sides, their heads slightly tilted as if listening to something far away. Hensley called out to them, asking if they were lost. They did not answer. Instead, they began walking toward the tree line, moving neither quickly nor slowly, but with a strange evenness that made it impossible to tell whether they were approaching or simply drawing farther into the distance. He took a step forward, and in that instant, without any clear transition, they were gone. Not hidden by the trees, not swallowed by shadow. Gone. When he reached the spot where they had been standing, there were no footprints in the damp grass. The air was cooler there, enough to raise gooseflesh along his arms despite the mild day. Hensley told no one at first. He wasn't afraid of being dismissed. He simply couldn't find the right words for what he had seen. It wasn't until the mid-1990s, during a conversation with a neighbor about the town's old stories, that he mentioned it. When shown a copy of the 1911 County Fair photograph, he pointed to the faces of Anna and Elspeth without hesitation. "That's them," he said. "Every detail. And I'm telling you, they were standing there in that field like they'd been waiting for me to notice them." His account would later be added to the collection of documented sightings, but for many, it marked the end of the trail. No confirmed reports have surfaced since. Whether the twins finally left Ashford Falls, or simply retreated beyond where anyone could follow, no one could say. But for those who believed, Hensley's sighting was not an ending, only the last time the Miller twins allowed themselves to be seen. Over more than a century, the mystery of Anna and Elspeth Miller has invited explanations from every corner, some grounded in reason, others reaching far beyond it. The rational theories are often the simplest. Some believe the twins' unchanged appearance was the result of a rare medical condition, one that slowed their growth and reserved their features far longer than normal. But even among doctors, this idea collapses when faced with the decades-long gap between sightings. No known disorder could halt aging so completely, nor explain the identical descriptions from witnesses generations apart. Others cling to the substitution theory, that the original twins died and were replaced by younger children who resembled them. Yet there is no record of other children entering the Miller household, no adoptions, no new births. And those who met the twins at different points in time swore they were not merely similar. They were the same. Then there are theories that step beyond the ordinary. Some claim the twins were bound to the Ashford River in ways no one could fully understand, perhaps as spirits, perhaps as something else entirely. The river, they point out, was present in nearly every confirmed sighting, its floods and frosts aligning too neatly with the girls' appearances to be coincidence. A more unsettling idea suggests they were not children at all, but something older wearing the shape of children, a guise that allowed them to move through the world unnoticed until the moment someone truly saw them. This theory finds its evidence in the accounts of their perfect synchronization, their unblinking stillness, and the way their presence seemed to alter the air and the ground around them. There are even those who believe the twins' existence was tied to the land itself, that their presence prolonged the lives of John and Clara Miller, and perhaps others, in exchange for something unspoken. The missing records, the hidden artifacts, the deliberate silences, all, they say, were part of keeping that arrangement intact. None of these theories, however, answers the question that hangs over every telling. Why? If the twins were supernatural, what did they want? If they were human, what kept them from changing? And if they were neither, then what place did they hold in the quiet machinery of Ashford Falls? In the end, every theory runs into the same wall. The twins are gone, and they took the truth with them. What remains is a shadow in the town's history, growing longer with each year they are not seen. Ashford Falls has changed in the years since the last reported sighting of Anna and Elspeth Miller. The roads are paved now, the old mill has been silent for decades, and the river runs quieter, its banks tamed by careful engineering. Yet for those who know where to look, the traces are still there. The faint outline of the Miller farmhouse beneath the weight of vines, the 2 weathered headstones on the hill, the gaps in the town's ledgers that no one has managed to fill. Walk along the Ashford River at dusk, and you may feel it. That momentary shift in the air, the sense of being watched from just beyond the edge of your vision. It is easy to dismiss, and easier still to forget once you've left the water behind. But the stories remain, carried in the quiet between conversations, in the way the oldest residents pause before answering certain questions. Perhaps the twins are gone. Their strange watch over the town ended at last. Or perhaps they are still here, standing in the places they have always stood, unseen until they choose otherwise. The truth may be buried in the missing records, or it may be something that never existed on paper at all. Over the years, people have come to Ashford Falls hoping to solve the mystery. They leave with photographs of the river, notes from old archives, and conversations scribbled in journals. But they never leave with answers, only with the weight of the same question that has hung over the town for more than a century. What became of Anna and Elspeth Miller? And if you are listening to this now, perhaps that question has settled into your mind too. If so, remember the pattern the town learned long ago, that speaking of the twins too often was an invitation. Some say they come when they are talked about. Others say they were never gone to begin with. So if you ever find yourself near a quiet riverbank in Oregon, and you see 2 girls standing in the shallows, pale and still, watching you without blinking, will you turn away? Or will you keep looking, knowing that they may have been waiting for you all along? If you've stayed with me through this entire telling, share it so others can decide for themselves whether the Miller twins are gone, or simply waiting for the next person who says their name. And if you want to hear more stories like this, mysteries time refuses to let go, make sure you subscribe, because the next one may already be on its way to you.